welcome to this week's edition of the Construction CPA's Coffee Cafe. I am the Construction CPA, Lisa Raish. We are dropping the hammer on cash flow problems so you can build things that matter. This week's topic is going to be why worker classification, difference between a W-2 and a 1099, matters for you in your construction business. So this is part of, this has a tax effect on it. So at the end of the day, this really kind of falls into our overall tax topics for the last, 3 or 4 weeks. So we're just going to continue that with the difference between that 1099 individual, excuse me, and that W-2 that works for you. So most contractors are going to want flexibility when they're hiring employees, but a lot of times classification, right? Whether you should classify them as an employee or a contractor becomes a really big issue. There is some compliance, IRS related compliance associated with that, but you want to make sure that you at least understand the generalities around those rules, so that you're mindful when you're hiring people and you're kind of dropping them into the correct bucket. So, I'm sure, like, how many of you have hired people? You've hired them as a 1099 contractor and you've done it simply because that's the way it's always been done. We see that all the time. That's the way that was done when I worked for the other contractor. This is the way I'm doing it in my business, so on and so forth. So, we're just going to talk about why that classification matters. Where it sometimes can lead you to tax issues, sometimes penalties with that, and overall just general compliance risks. So, kind of why does this matter? In construction, we see a lot where workers may look like subcontractors, but they really aren't actually a subcontractor like you think of. They really are an employee, right? And so that's where the difference between that W-2 person and that 1099 falls, right? So, if you classify that individual incorrectly, there is going to be some type of payroll taxes that probably are not handled appropriately. There will be compliance related risks that are there. There may be risks with your overall insurance policies, your workers' comp, things like that. Um, Both sides could potentially be subject to penalties and fines. You, as the employer, right? There are issues that not only on the tax side, there's also labor issues, right? So the Department of Labor versus the IRS, right? Two federal agencies, but again, have similar similarities when it comes to classifying employees or contractors, right? So it's not just, oh, I need to fill out certain kinds of paperwork. It's actually going to ultimately affect your taxes, your overall compliance, and ultimately how your business operates. So, what are some of the common mistakes that we tend to see? So, first, it's we treat everybody as a contractor, right? Everybody who comes in the door is a contractor. Why? Because it's just simpler. You pay them, and what we see also is we still, paying contractors every week like you would pay an employee. Um, so that's an issue as well. But what the IRS is looking at, and what I want you to keep in mind, is the IRS and the Department of Labor both have these control tests, right? And there are specifics in the control tests. I believe the IRS has 10, the Department of Labor might as well. They're not identical, but they're very close. And what I want you to really think about is the really most important things. Do you have control over the work, right? Are you controlling when they need to arrive? Are you offering or providing tools and equipment for that person to use? So, for example, if you're telling, let's call him Bob, he needs to arrive at this location on a Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. You've given him a truck with all of your tools on it. He's your employee because you've got control over where he's going, when he's going, and you're giving him everything he needs to do such thing. He's not a contractor. He, doesn't have the capacity to kind of come and go as he pleases. Um, like you would if you truly were a contractor, right? So it's not just saying, oh, he's a 1099. No, you really want to look at that classification, right? That control test is ultimately the biggest thing that you want to be looking at and thinking about. Um, there is a general misunderstanding between the two. I've seen clients come in and they have 1099 contractors and they call them employees, right? And again, at the end of the day, they're doing all the things and acting as employees, so they really are. But if they're a contractor, you're not calling them an employee or vice versa, right? So in general, your employee is typically going to follow whatever your company schedule is. We work 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day, right? And you get a 30-minute lunch. Whatever, again, whatever your company rules are. You've provided company tools, you've provided a company truck. There's a supervisor that they have to kind of check in with, right? And that supervisor ultimately checks back in with you as the owner or as the manager, right? That's typically going to be an employee relationship. When we're talking about a true subcontractor, they're going to control their own work. They're going to provide their own equipment. They're going to work independently. You're typically going to sign a contract with them because you're going to want them to do X, Y, and Z at this one location. There might be a time frame where, okay, you're the plumber and we really need you to come in like at this time frame, i.e., this work week, but as the sub, you're the one coming in. The owner of the business isn't saying you have to be here at that time. You have to do this, this, and this at this time, right? That's the difference ultimately between your sub and your employee. So, again, a lot of what we see is people truly are employees and not actually subcontractors like they think that they are. So, again, you bring in a outside company that is doing, again, if you're building a whole subdivision of homes and they're coming in and they're doing the plumbing in each one of those properties as you are building them, they are most likely a subcontractor. They have their own business. They come and go when they want. They, in fact, have their own employees. Those employees come and go. That's ultimately really on a very high level. It's that control test, right? You're going to hear the control over and over again. That's going to be the difference. That person who works for all kinds of different people, different companies, comes and goes as your sub, is truly your sub. But the guy who comes and works on your job sites 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, you're maybe calling him a sub, but he's not a sub. He's most likely going to be an employee. A lot of times, one of the things that we see is you're trying to avoid payroll taxes. So we'll see that businesses classify as 1099s. They don't want to pay payroll taxes. They're looking to get around or skirt the workers' comp rules. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, if the classification is in fact incorrect, and you kind of get called out on that classification incorrectness, you are going to pay back taxes and penalties and interest on those back taxes. So it could, in fact, get very expensive for you. A lot of companies, unfortunately, have very poor record keeping, right? So when you don't have clear documentation, it really becomes hard for you to defend those classifications. So in some cases, with a lack of documentation, there may be just a classification, a reclass, just because you don't have the information to properly, document that. Oh, it actually was a subcontractor. When you don't have that and that info or a contract with them or have that to prove, again, poor record keeping, poor documentation. Those are the things that are going to have an audit swing in the other direction for you, where it's actually not to your benefit, right? So you want to stay compliant, and like anything else, you want to maintain the appropriate and correct records, because those are the things that you want to make sure that you have, so that you can in fact prove, yes, this is an employee. No, that is not. It's actually a sub, right? Um, One thing with subs is you've got to have a clear contract, right? You want to have a written agreement with your sub like you would with any other contract you're getting into. Define what the relationship is. What are they going to do? What are you going to do? Who has what responsibilities? Again, without them, there's a misunderstanding about who does what and when. It's not clear as to who's in control, right? Those are all going to create compliance risks for you, and then ultimately, again, possibly down the road, a reclassification, which could get very expensive for you. All right, so what are some of the things that you can do today? Um, you know, Real things that you can walk away and say, all right, I need to look at this or do this, right? So the first is you need to just understand the general control test. and understand what the difference between that employee and that subcontractor are, right? So your classification should reflect how that relationship truly functions. If you're telling somebody to be at the site tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. and you're telling them how to do the job, they're going to be an employee. That's not a subcontractor. Make sure you document your agreements, and you want to do this clearly. Even if it's an employee, you want to have an employee agreement, and if it's a sub, you want to have an agreement as to what they've been contracted to do, right? The contracts will define everybody's responsibilities. You are responsible for X, Y, and Z. I, as the employer, or the other company, are going to be responsible for ABC, right? It's clearly defined, and that also will help to build up that independence, right? If you truly are a sub, or you're truly hiring a subcontractor, you're going to have a clear agreement as, we need you to go in here and do this thing. Again, I use the plumbing example. The plumber is going to come in and put all the plumbing into that residential dwelling that you're building, right? You have a contract because they're going to do these things, right? It's all laid out. And in many cases, that sub is truly giving you a bid, right, for that project. That's a real contractor sub relationship. You need to maintain organized payroll records and contractor records. Organized payroll, are you paying people by the hour? If you are, you need to have accurate payroll records. You've got to have, I-9s and W-4s. If you have a contractor relationship, you need to have proper W-9s. They should be invoicing you after they've done XYZ work for you. You shouldn't just be paying them for the hours they worked last week, right? That's an employee relationship. That's not a contractor relationship. Make sure you understand your workers' comp classification rules. So, for example, we see this a lot as well. Oh, this is a 1099. You can clearly see they're not a 1099. But when workers' comp comes around, what are they looking for? They're looking for the 1099 that you gave them, and they're also looking for the W-9 that they've given you, and a certificate of insurance from that other company stating they have insurance. So if that person who's your sub but doesn't carry their own insurance, there's a really good chance they actually are not a true subcontractor. They're really your employee. And then make sure you just understand and you work with the professionals that can help you with this compliance, right? Um, it's something, it's not going to take you hours and hours to deal with, but it's something you want to be mindful, right? Make sure when you are working with your insurance people that you understand who the subs are and who the subs aren't, so that you're not paying for people that you don't need to. Make sure when you're working with any other professional, that they understand your industry, and it can help you to make those decisions, but get ahead of them before they get expensive for you down the road. So, really at the end of the day, classifying your workers correctly is going to protect your business, not only from unnecessary taxes, but really from compliance problems, which can get super expensive for you anyways. So just to kind of recap, recap. So your classification is going to affect your payroll tax expense, your compliance costs, your overall financial organization, and then ultimately the long-term stability of your business, right? These are things that you want to make sure that you're aware of and that you are clear on. Again, do you clearly have employees? And honestly, I'd say 9 out of 10 times, it really is a true employee relationship and not really a 1099 or a contractor relationship. But again, make sure that you understand the difference between the two. High level, right? High level control test. Are you telling them where to go, when, be there, and you're giving them the tools? Then they're probably an employee. All right. Well, if you have any questions or anything, drop your thoughts into the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. I look forward to seeing you here every week. Follow us here and on the social channels at The Construction CPA. I look forward to seeing you here every week, and I'll see you next week.